Okay, students, so Unit 1 is Introduction to Inclusive Education. So I'll be going quite slow initially, although we're going to speed up after this unit. I'm going to start off quite slowly. We're going to talk about what inclusive education is within both the international context and within the South African context. But these two are closely interlinked. One does affect the other. As with most things in our world, what happens internationally does trickle down to what's happening in South Africa. That being said, we have to understand that irrespective of what's happening internationally, how it is interpreted in a South African context is very specific, because the challenges that we face within our country due to the socio-political climate that we currently live in and what was happening in our country 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago in terms of apartheid and segregation, it has a different effect on how we interpret inclusive education in our country. Okay, with that, let's get started. So what is inclusive education? As you might know, as you may have seen, there are various interpretations and definitions of what inclusive education is. People get confused because when they say inclusive education, they constantly think of challenges, or the word disability, the word unable to, or differently abled. This is not what inclusive education is about. Inclusive education has come to mean different things, but what we actually consider to be within the South African context is providing an environment that everyone feels that they belong in, that they can add value, to the school environment, the communities. It's really a way of thinking and a way of living. It includes broad principles such as an equitable system, a quality education system, where everyone takes responsibility, but also everybody is responsible to include others and accept others for who they are and the way in which they learn and the way in which they are able to interact with others. It includes things like race, learning challenges or learning differences, language, age, religion, socioeconomic background, cultural origin, etc., etc., etc. So it's really about accepting people for who they are. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the history of inclusive education, but I want us to start at the point of keeping this in mind. South Africa has come through decades of segregation, decades of people being made to feel different because of the color of their skin, also due to their gender as well. So if you think about this, we have grown up in a climate which talks about differences, which makes people feel other or makes people feel as if they are not good enough if they don't meet a specific standard. So inclusive education is really about addressing this and changing the system and changing the way in which we think. As teachers, you have come to believe that you need to have students of a specific type in your class. So for example, if there are learners who are visually challenged, if they are auditory challenged, if they are in a wheelchair, usually people think of students like that being in a different class. Inclusive education says no. What we need is one space where everybody is included and everyone is accommodated in one space. What does this mean for us? This means we have to shrug off the mindset that we've been, if I can use the word, indoctrinated with throughout our lives. We come, as I say, through generations of being made to feel separate and different, and therefore we feel that there's a space for everybody dependent on what they are able to do, how they're able to learn. But we need to realize, as it says here, that all learners, irrespective of their differences and abilities, they have needs, and we need to realize that everyone needs to feel included in spaces in which we operate. So what does this mean? Our goal should be to work towards a democratic society within which people in workspaces, in classroom spaces are all accommodated. So your classroom should have students of varying abilities, various ages, various races, as well as different challenges. So for example, you can have a classroom space with students who aren't able to see or aren't able to hear. They aren't able maybe to walk, but our school spaces should accommodate all of them so that no child feels as if they are other, no child feels as if they don't belong. But we'll get into a lot more of this as we go through this course. So what are some of the important tenets of inclusive education? What are the things that are really the values of inclusive education? So we can talk about things like redress, we can talk about equality, ensuring that everybody feels as if they are part of something bigger than themselves and that they're important in the space. It's about being inclusive, it's about being embracing differences, supporting differences, as well as collectively feeling like we belong to something bigger than ourselves and that we can contribute to something bigger than ourselves. So it's a lot about empowerment, the belief and attitude. It is everyone's right to be in a classroom. It is everyone's right to be included and not put in a quote unquote special school because they don't fit into the what we think is the normal. And I use this word very carefully. What is the normal of that's accepted in our communities and in our environment? Okay, so it's about making our communities accessible for all. Yes, it is about putting ramps in various areas so to accommodate students or people that have wheelchairs. That is one thing. But what about adapting our classroom spaces to ensure that students who aren't able maybe to hear are still included in our classroom spaces so that they can also learn in the same way that their peers are learning? It's about planning for success for our learners based on their strengths. So I don't know what your experience of schooling has been, but I'm going to get personal and talk about my own. In my schooling experience, everyone was given the same assessment. Everyone is expected to do their tasks in exactly the same way, irrespective of what their strengths were and what the areas of growth or challenges were. In a more inclusive environment, we would adapt our environments, adapt our teaching, and adapt our assessments. So this could be in a classroom space if we were teaching our students, for example, about the growth of trees. We could then provide a visual stimulus, which would be perhaps notes on a board, notes printed out for them on the projector, whatever the case may be. We could also provide a video so that students who learn in a more auditory style can both hear and see the topic information. We could have a more kinesthetic type of learning medium available so they could learn by doing something, doing an activity, doing a puzzle. So these are the ways in which we can adapt our environment. So we're going to get very practical in this course later on and in inclusive education too, but for now we're setting the foundation. So it's important that you really understand all of these tenets. So in our education environment, I'm going to speak for myself first. In my education environment, it was a very one-size-fits-all type of approach. So if you were different or if you were not able to learn in the same way, you were then excluded by taking you to what they used to call the remedial class or the aanpassings class, where students with differences were made to do tasks that were different to what the rest of the class was doing. So they were often behind the rest of the class or the rest of their peers to a point where they would get to grade 5, grade 6, grade 7, and would often have to be removed and go into a different system, or they just keep falling behind and keep failing. And this is not what we want, because people will not be feeling that they're adding value to the space. They won't be feeling as if they have value, which is a very sad thing to think about a child having to experience. So every person should view themselves in a positive way, and as teachers, we should view our students in a positive way as well. So it's really a mindset change. It's different from what we've grown up experiencing and what we've grown up doing. What I do want to make clear though is that we have to understand that due to challenges of different students, so they may have a specific learning disorder. They may have what we used to call dyslexia. It's now a specific learning disorder that we will talk about later on in this course. If they do have a challenge like that, if they do have ADHD as a barrier to learning, that is also part of including students in our classes, they may perhaps need to work at a slower pace, and that's okay. So if we are working with students, some of our students, we can call them the maybe higher performing students, if they are working 2 or 3 chapters ahead, and our learners with learning barriers or learning challenges are 2 chapters behind, that is okay as long as that child feels that they are reaching their specific potential. That is what we are moving towards, an environment that accommodates children according to where they are at rather than where we expect them to be. So if a child enters a schooling system and they are expected, according to the curriculum, to be able to do from A, B, C up until Z. If one child is able to achieve that within a 2-week period and can complete the alphabet and knows exactly what the letters look like and what words you can make up with the letters, that is according to their potential. If another child comes into the system without having ever learned the alphabet but is able to go up until or learn the alphabet up until G or J or whatever the case is, as long as there is movement in their learning, as long as they are able to reach their potential at that point, we have to accept that as a success, because the child there is movement, there is learning, and the child is moving towards the next stage of their development and their learning ability. It's not something that is working in our environments at the moment because we are so pushed to finish a curriculum, to complete all the tasks that are required, that we often are leaving students behind. So this is the reason really for the change in the way we are viewing education. So as I said, there are various definitions of inclusive education. I've just put down 3 here for you, but I encourage you to go and look up inclusive education on various platforms and see what it says about inclusive education and put together a working definition for yourself. So by the time you get to the end of this course, you should be able to present yourself or present a definition that you understand, that you've internalized through the process of your own research, as well as the research that will be, as well as the information that will be provided for you throughout this course. Okay, so I think an important distinction that we need to make right at the onset of this course is the difference between integration and inclusive education. They are different. And I found this very nice diagram which shows us what exactly the various or these various phrases and these various practices look like. So exclusion, as we know, is about certain people being accepted into the system and those with differences or challenges being excluded and kept outside of that system. And that's what the system we come out of, or the system that we are trying to come out of. Segregation, also something we know about, keeping those that fit into the mold, keeping them in the system, and everyone that doesn't fit into that little picture is excluded and kept outside and is different. Integration, now careful, you look at integration. Integration is accepting or bringing those people, or bringing those learners, let's talk about learners, into the system, but they are still separate within that system. They don't really fit in. They're expected to fit in, but they don't because of their learning barriers. So they're pushed into a mold which doesn't fit them and doesn't suit them and doesn't suit their abilities, doesn't suit their learning styles, doesn't take into consideration their learning barriers, but they are forced into the mold. So you can, from your own experience and just from imagining, understand what that experience is like for somebody who already feels different. Inclusion is about having everybody in that system, or having everybody in the system and accommodating them depending on how they need, what their needs are. Okay, everyone has different needs. We need to accommodate that. And then we'll talk about teaching to diversity, and that is our goal. So teaching to diversity is including everyone's differences and understanding how that impacts their learning, number one, and how we can accommodate that and use that to our advantage or to the learner's advantage within the classroom space. So inclusion means that all teachers are responsible for the education of every single child, and we need to adapt our curriculum to cope with diversity and to understand that the diversity is not a barrier for us, but rather it is a helpful medium through which learners can express themselves and which can make learning easier for students. So as you can see, the notes give you a brief explanation of both. Integration is preparing pupils for placement in ordinary school. So we're not changing the school, we're not adapting anything, but we're forcing the child to adapt to what's happening in the school. So you as the teacher is expecting the child, irrespective of what their abilities are, you are forcing them, or I'm not saying you specifically, but we are forcing them to fit into our expectations of a learner. Whereas inclusive education is talking about taking into consideration and celebrating the diversity of our learners and shifting the way in which we teach and the way in which the curriculum is presented to accommodate for the learning differences and challenges. And this is just a further explanation of inclusion and integration. So the next part of this video, this is a 2-part video because we are going quite slow. The next part of this video is going to take us a little bit in depth in terms of the history of inclusive education and a little bit more detail around the various aspects thereof.